Sophie Rand had been sleeping on an air mattress in the living room of her friend Jade's apartment on Carey Street in Richmond since the second week of September, which was 6 weeks before the letter from the estate attorney arrived, and which had come about because the apartment she had shared with her ex-boyfriend had been in his name, and he had given her 12 days' notice, which she had thought at the time was more notice than she had expected from him, and which she still thought 6 weeks later was slightly less notice than the situation had deserved. She was 22. She worked the dinner service at a farm-to-table restaurant on East Main Street 4 nights a week, the kind of restaurant that had a thoughtful wine list and seasonal menus and paid its line cooks $13.50 an hour and expected them to work with speed and precision, and without complaint about either, which Sophie did, because she was good at it and because she had no current alternative. She had $1,400 in a savings account and a very clear sense of what $1,400 could and could not do in Richmond in October. The air mattress was a good air mattress. She was grateful for it and for Jade, who asked nothing of her beyond a proportionate share of the utilities and the company of someone who understood what it meant to be starting over. The letter came on a Monday, forwarded from her last address by the Postal Service to Jade's building. It was from an attorney named Russell Pratt in Charlottesville, and it informed her that her great-uncle Edmund Rand, 84, had died in early October, that Sophie had been named in Edmund's will, and that a distribution meeting was scheduled for the following Friday. Edmund Rand had been her grandfather's younger brother, a man she had met at 2 family gatherings before he had stopped attending family gatherings, which had happened years before she was paying attention to such things. What she knew about Edmund Rand was that he had been a retired agricultural extension agent, that he had lived alone in Albemarle County for most of his adult life, and that at some point the family had decided he was difficult, which was the word used in family conversations to describe people who had simply stopped agreeing with everyone else about how things should be. She had never found this particularly damning. She drove to Charlottesville on Friday morning. Russell Pratt's office was on the downtown mall, the conference room looking out on the brick pedestrian street below. Her cousin Philip was already there when she arrived, and his sister Claire was on the phone from a connection that kept breaking up and eventually disconnected entirely during the first reading. Philip Rand was 41, managed investment portfolios for a firm in McLean, and looked at every situation with the same rapid assessment he applied to everything. Value in, value out, what is the position worth? He had already assessed this one. Sophie could see that in how he sat, settled, finished, waiting for the reading to confirm his math. Russell Pratt read the estate in order. Edmund's house in Keswick, a 4-bedroom farmhouse on 12 acres, assessed at $485,000, went to Philip and Claire jointly. The investment account, $112,000, went to Philip and Claire equally. The vehicles, the personal property, the contents of the house, jointly to Philip and Claire. Then Russell Pratt turned a page and said that the Rand Chapel property, the 1870 chapel structure and the 6-acre parcel on Garland Mill Road in northern Albemarle County, currently assessed at $42,000 and carrying a conditional structural notice from the county issued in 2021, passed in full to Sophie Aileen Rand. Philip said, without particular unkindness, the chapel. He said it the way you say the name of something you have already written off. He said that Edmund had tried to sell that property twice in the last 15 years and both sales had fallen through. Once because of the structural notice and once because the buyer had pulled financing, and that the diocese had declined to take it back when Edmund had offered it in 2018. He said the county structural notice was based on the east wall and the vestry roof, and that the remediation estimate he had seen was in the range of $40,000. He said he was not sure what Sophie was going to do with a crumbling chapel on 6 acres in northern Albemarle County. He said all of this calmly and without cruelty. He was, as far as Sophie could tell, genuinely trying to give her useful information. She thanked him and signed where Russell Pratt directed. She drove to Garland Mill Road that same afternoon. The lane to the chapel was gravel, half a mile through mixed woodland, oak and hickory and tulip poplar, the trees on either side still holding most of their October color, yellow and orange and the particular rust red of oak in late fall. The chapel appeared at the end of the lane in a small clearing, and she stopped the car and sat looking at it for a moment before she got out. The structure was Virginia fieldstone, pale gray, the stones laid with the particular care of 19th century church construction, tight joints, plumb corners, walls that leaned into the hillside behind them with the confidence of something built to last, and knowing it. The slate roof was mostly intact. She could see one small gap over the vestry at the east end where a section had slipped, but the main body of the roof was sound. The lancet windows on both side walls still had most of their leaded glass, the small diamond panes in various shades of amber and pale green, some broken and some not. A stone bell coat rose above the west gable, no bell, but the coat itself was intact, its pointed cap weathered but whole. She walked to the entrance, a pointed arched doorway with a heavy oak door. The door was unlocked. The interior had the specific quality of religious spaces that have been abandoned, a quietness that is not simply the absence of sound, but the presence of accumulated silence, as though the room had been listening to itself for a long time. The nave was 35 feet long and 16 feet wide, the walls fieldstone to the shoulder height and plaster above, the plaster cracked in a few places but intact, the ghost of a painted geometric design still visible in the crown of the shallow barrel vault. 6 original oak pews remained, 3 on each side of the center aisle, their surfaces dark and smooth with age. The chancel at the east end was slightly raised, 2 stone steps, the altar gone but the low oak altar rail still in place, its turned spindles intact. She walked the center aisle slowly. The floor was irregular flagstone in a herringbone pattern, worn smooth in the path of a century of Sunday feet. The afternoon light came through the leaded windows at a low angle and fell in amber and pale green rectangles across the stone floor and the dark oak pews. She stood at the chancel step and looked around the room for a moment before she looked at the floor. She had not expected to feel anything particular here, but she did. The chapel had a quality she had only encountered in a few places before, the quality of a space that had been built for something larger than shelter and had retained that intention in its walls even after the purpose had been removed. The fieldstone held the light differently than brick or plaster, the way rough stone always does, not reflecting it, but absorbing it and giving back something warmer and more particular, a light that seemed to come from inside the walls rather than from the windows. The 6 remaining pews were still arranged in 2 rows with the center aisle between them, which meant that whoever had closed this chapel had left them exactly as they stood on the last Sunday, which struck Sophie as a decision made with some care. She walked to the nearest pew and set her hand on its back rail. The wood was smooth and cold and completely solid. She walked the center aisle to the chancel step. She stood at the chancel step and looked at the floor. She was looking at the floor because she had been looking at floors for weeks. In the restaurant, in Jade's apartment, in every building she walked through, as though floors had recently revealed themselves to be more interesting than she had previously understood. What she saw in the floor of the chancel was not subtle, but she had needed to be standing at exactly this angle in exactly this light to see it. One of the flagstones in the center of the chancel floor, roughly 2 feet square, had an iron ring set into its surface, folded flat into a cut recess. Around the edges of this stone, the joints were not the irregular organic joints of the surrounding herringbone floor. They were straight, precise, the same width on all 4 sides. A fitted stone, not a floor stone. She descended the chancel step and crossed to it and crouched. She pulled the ring upright. She pulled. The stone was heavy but balanced. It lifted on a pivot point at the far edge, and then she caught it and held it and set it against the altar rail. And underneath was a shaft of stone steps descending into the dark. The air that came up was cold and still and dry, the smell of old stone and something else underneath it. A faint sweetness she could not name until much later, when she would recognize it as the smell of silver that has been stored in sealed canvas for a very long time. She went back to her car and got her flashlight. The steps were 12 in number, cut stone, the walls closing in as she descended. The crypt was 20 feet by 12, its ceiling a brick vault rising to 7 feet at the crown, the bricks laid in a careful ellipse that had not moved in 150 years. The walls were the same Virginia fieldstone as the chapel above. The floor was packed earth covered with fine sand, dry as chalk. The drainage was excellent. She could see the outlet channel at the base of the south wall, a stone-cut groove that had been keeping moisture out of this room since before the Civil War. Against the north wall, stacked too high on wooden shelving built into the recessed niches. 6 large wooden cases, each roughly 3 feet by 2 feet and 8 inches deep, each fitted with rope handles at both ends and sealed with a fitted lid. She counted them. 6 cases, each large enough that she could not have lifted one alone. On the east shelf, a worn leather satchel, its drawstring tied. On the south shelf, beside the drainage outlet, an iron strongbox painted black, its hasp closed, no visible lock. She went to the nearest wooden case and worked the lid with her pry bar, the nails giving slowly, the wood dense and dry. Inside, canvas, dark green, fitted to the interior dimensions and tied at the corners. She loosened the canvas and folded it back. Beneath it, silver. A dinner plate, round, the rim engraved with a crest. A running stag above a banner. The silver surface still bright under the century of dust, the hallmarks visible on the underside when she turned it. A lion passant, a date letter, an anchor, and a maker's mark she could not read. She set it down carefully on the canvas and looked at the other items visible beneath it. A second plate, identical. Below those, the curved handle of what appeared to be a serving ladle. She did not remove anything else. She opened the second case. More plates, the same crest, the same hallmarks. She opened the third. A soup tureen, its body and lid together, also engraved, also marked. She stopped opening cases. She went to the leather satchel. The drawstring was stiff, but came loose. Inside, 2 smaller cloth bags, their contents heavy for their size. She opened the first and poured a small number of coins into her palm. Gold, the size of an American dime, but thicker, the portrait of a woman on the obverse with a crown, and the legend Victoria Dagra Brit Regina around the edge. On the reverse, a mounted warrior, St. George. British sovereigns. She held them in the light of her flashlight and looked at them and then poured them back carefully. She opened the second bag. American gold coins, larger, the obverse showing liberty with a coronet and stars, the reverse an eagle, $10 eagles from the late 1800s by the dates she could read on the top coins. She put both bags back in the satchel and went to the iron strongbox. The hasp was not locked. She lifted it, and the lid opened on hinges that had not corroded. Inside, 2 items, placed flat. The first was a property deed, heavy paper, handwritten, the date 1878, describing 34 acres of Albemarle County farmland in the name of Randolph Clement Rand, borders described by stream and road in the language of 19th century survey. The second was a letter. It was written on Rand family letterhead, a printed crest at the top, the same running stag she had seen on the silver, in a large, confident hand, with a quality of permanence in the strokes of the letters, as though the writer had been used to writing things that would be kept. The date at the top, August 14, 1917. The writer identified himself as Randolph Clement Rand and wrote without preamble. He wrote that with the war in Europe in its 3rd year and uncertainty at home and his son already in France with the 116th Infantry, he had decided to place the family silver and the family gold in the crypt below the nave, where the Rand family had buried its dead and kept its best things since the chapel was consecrated in 1870. He wrote that the silver service had been brought from England in 1849 by his grandfather James Rand, who had commissioned it from the firm of Thomas Bradbury and Sons in Sheffield, 147 pieces for a service for 24, every piece engraved with the family crest that James Rand had designed himself, and had considered one of the better decisions of a life he was generally satisfied with. He wrote that James Rand had used the full service every Sunday for dinner without exception for 38 years, which Randolph considered a record unlikely to be broken. He wrote that the gold coins represented his own savings and his father's before him. The British sovereigns accumulated over 20 years from a dealer in Charlottesville because he had always considered the British sovereign the most reliable coin in the world, made to a standard that had not changed in a century, and the American eagles from the same period because he had trusted American gold and British gold equally and could see no reason to choose between them. He wrote that the 34 acres of the North Field had had 3 purchase offers in his time, and he had declined all 3. Not because the prices were wrong, but because his family had owned that land since 1878, and he did not believe in selling land you had held for 40 years because someone else had decided it was suddenly more valuable. He wrote that he had not told his wife, Margaret, where he had put these things, because she worried about the war more than he wanted her to worry about anything additional, and because he believed they would be back in the house by Christmas, which turned out to be a more optimistic estimate than the facts would later support. He wrote, at the end in a final sentence that sat apart from the rest, "Whoever finds this will be someone who came looking, and someone who comes looking deserves what they find." Sophie sat on the packed earth floor of the crypt with the letter in her hands and read it again, slowly. She thought about a man who had put 147 pieces of silver and a satchel of gold into a stone room in 1917 and told his wife nothing about it and had meant to come back before Christmas. She thought about what it meant that the silver had been used every Sunday for 38 years and then sealed in canvas and put in the dark, and had been in the dark ever since. She thought about the 34 acres of North Field that had had 3 purchase offers and had turned them all down, and she thought that Randolph Rand had been the kind of man it would have been useful to know. She drove back to Richmond and called Russell Pratt in the morning. He referred her to an antique silver specialist in Richmond named Jonathan Frey, who had handled several significant estate silver collections in the Mid-Atlantic region. She called Frey's office and described what she had found. He asked about the hallmarks. She read them from the photographs she had taken. He asked her to spell the maker's mark notation as best she could. She did. He said he could come Thursday. Jonathan Frey arrived at the chapel at 9 in the morning with a UV lamp, a jeweler's loupe on a lanyard, a diamond point scribe, a portable reference library in a canvas bag, and the focused, unhurried quality of a man who has spent 40 years not rushing anything important. He descended to the crypt and opened every case himself, working one at a time, removing each piece of silver with gloved hands, holding it under the UV lamp, reading the hallmarks with the loupe, making notations in a small green notebook. He was in the crypt for 3 hours. He came up and stood in the nave for a moment, looking at the leaded windows and the pale stone walls and the ghost of the painted ceiling, before he sat down in one of the old oak pews. He was quiet for a moment. He told her that in 40 years of working with antique silver, he had been in perhaps 8 or 9 cellars and vaults where significant pieces had been stored long-term, and that the condition of what was in the crypt below was among the 2 or 3 best examples of unintentional conservation he had encountered. The canvas and the fitted cases, and above all the complete dryness of the crypt, had preserved the surfaces in a way that a museum storage room would not have done better. He said the drainage channel in the south wall was the key to all of it. He said he had examined it while he was down there and it was still functioning, which meant it had been functioning every day for 150 years without anyone to maintain it, which he considered one of the more impressive things he had seen in a long time. Then he told Sophie what she had. He said the silver service was 147 pieces, as the letter had described, and that every piece he had examined bore consistent Sheffield hallmarks dated to the period 1847 to 1849. From the firm of Thomas Bradbury and Sons, a highly regarded Sheffield manufacturer whose work had been exported extensively to American clients in the mid-Victorian period. The service was complete, he said. Dinner plates, soup plates, dessert plates, serving dishes, tureens, sauceboats, ladles, flatware for 24 settings, 2 sets of candlesticks, a complete tea service, and a complete coffee service. Every piece bore the Rand family crest in good quality engraving, which he said added to rather than subtracted from the value because it added provenance and history. He said the condition was extraordinary given the age and the storage. The canvas and the dry crypt had kept the pieces from the tarnishing and surface damage that destroyed most Victorian silver kept in damp environments. He gave her a range. At a specialist silver auction, he named 3 houses in London and 1 in New York. A complete Victorian sterling service of this quality, size, and provenance could expect to bring between $420,000 and $580,000. He said the range was wide because the market for Victorian silver at this scale had been volatile, but that the completeness of the service and the quality of the maker were both factors that pushed toward the upper end. A numismatist Sophie contacted through Russell Pratt assessed the coins the following week. The British sovereigns, 180 coins, mixed dates from 1876 to 1909, condition ranging from extremely fine to about uncirculated. Gold spot value plus collector premium, total $78,000. The American $10 eagles, 24 coins, dates from 1893 to 1901, about uncirculated on average, total $94,000. Combined, $172,000. Russell Pratt filed the 34-acre North Field deed with Albemarle County on a Wednesday. By the following Monday, Sophie had received 3 unsolicited purchase inquiries. Albemarle County land, particularly North County woodlands within 20 miles of Charlottesville, had been appreciating at rates that real estate agents described with the particular reverence reserved for things that have exceeded their own expectations. The 34 acres were assessed at $1.3 million. One of the purchase offers was for $1.4 million. She did not accept it. Philip called 11 days after the county filing. He said the North Field had always been considered part of the broader Rand family land holdings. He said family 4 times in 2 minutes, which Sophie counted without meaning to. She listened until he was finished and then told him that all communication should go through Russell Pratt, and she meant it with no particular heat, and she ended the call. She sold the silver service through Christie's London in a dedicated Victorian silver sale in March. It brought $504,000, above the midpoint of Jonathan Frey's range, below his upper estimate. The coins sold through the Richmond numismatist at the assessed value. She held the North Field. She kept the chapel. The east vestry roof was repaired first. A straightforward slate repair, not a rebuild. 4 days of work by a stonemason from Staunton who had grown up working on historic Virginia fieldstone structures and handled the Rand Chapel's stone with the care of someone who knew what he was looking at. The county structural notice was lifted in January. She had the chancel flagstone reinstated over the crypt access, not sealed, just fitted, and she had the iron ring cleaned and oiled so it would move smoothly. She kept the crypt dry, maintained the drainage channel, and went down there once a month to check that nothing had changed, which nothing ever had. The old brickwork holding as it always had held, in the dark and the dry and the patient quiet of a room that knew how to wait. She moved out of Jade's living room in February and rented an apartment in Charlottesville, 10 minutes from the Garland Mill Road Lane. She was 22 years old. She had been sleeping on an air mattress on Carey Street in Richmond with $1,400 in savings, and a man she had never met had sealed 147 pieces of silver and a letter in a stone room in 1917, and had written that whoever came looking deserved what they found. She had come looking. She thought that was the most important thing she had learned from any of this, that looking was its own kind of answer, and that it started before you had any reason to believe it would pay off. If this story stayed with you, please hit that like button right now and subscribe to Buried Fortune for more stories of hidden discoveries, impossible inheritances, and the fortunes nobody saw coming. Hit the notification bell so you never miss one. Tell us in the comments, if you found a sealed crypt beneath a chapel floor, would you have gone down?